Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hi, you're listening to the Great Women in Compliance Podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. We are wishing you a happy new year, and this is our first podcast of 2021. We are really excited to start out with one of our conversations. It's an informal one with some questions from what we're calling an Ask Us Anything. And I am just always looking forward to and enjoying the opportunity to get to speak with Mary about all of my favorite topics, ethics and compliance, because I don't know about you all, but for me during the holiday season, it wasn't the first topic amongst my family and friends, although it probably should have been. So with that, we're going to get started with our first Ask Us Anything, and we are so excited for everything that's coming up in 2021. We have great guests, we have some discussions, and we hope that you all are as energized as we are. So with that, Mary, I think I'm ready to get started. Do you want me to ask the first question?
Certainly. Thanks, Lisa.
Sure. Here's one for you as somebody who's not born in the United States, but do you think the change in administration in the U.S. will change compliance enforcement? And if so, how?
Wow, that's a really hard one. I think I'm about as equally qualified to answer that as who I think will be playing in the Super Bowl. The only answer I would have for that would be not the Bengals. I think there will be some changes. I'm anticipating that overall things will still keep ticking along. We'll see enforcement action. We'll continue to see guidance coming out to help us advance our compliance programs and understand the government priorities more. But overall, I'm not expecting too much. However, you can all take that with a grain of salt, given that I am not super qualified to answer that question. So maybe it's just interesting from an outsider perspective.
Well, I think it is. Yeah, I think it is interesting from an outsider perspective. I also think that there is a team called the Buffalo Bills that does have a chance of winning the Super Bowl. So, Mary, in honor of the podcast, you can keep that in mind. But with that said, I think that there will be some increased enforcement against organizations. I know there's been a lot of big dollar, some big dollar ones and some international ones. I think there's going to be some more consistent enforcement. And I think there's going to be a focus, although I don't think it's going to be the primary focus right away, given all of the different tasks that the new administration will be working on from a COVID standpoint and a health and safety standpoint and other things. But I do think that there will be a focus on what could have been issues that arise out of the COVID situation and others where people may have taken advantage of systems and programs. Mm-hmm. I think that's my take on it. So,
yeah, that makes sense. Another question that we've got is you've often mentioned having different working styles to each other. What is the key to working well as a team on GWIC in those circumstances?
I think for me, one of the things is that we're allowed to make it complement one another because we do a fair amount on our own. Mm-hmm. But I think that one of the biggest keys is to understand that the different styles and what helps you to get the results that you would like to get and what you're working on, and to not think that somehow when my style is different, that somehow it's letting us down as a team. Mm-hmm. And also I think that what also is key is that I learn from you. I learn about, some of the different things or different approaches, which I think is tremendously helpful. So that for me is the big, the two things that I think really help us.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And from my perspective, one of them is always assuming good intent. And I think when you're choosing colleagues that you work with, as in our circumstance, versus in your more conventional workplace where you might be in an office in a compliance function, it's a lot harder to assume good intent. I've had a situation where a coach said to me after I explained a certain situation, wow, they're gaslighting you. And in that situation, it's really hard to assume good intent. But with you, because, you're a friend as well as a colleague, it's so much easier to be like, we seem to be thinking along different lines for this, but I so know that it's not personal or, anything that's motivated by negative intent. So assuming good intent and thinking, okay, I'm seeing this from my perspective. How might Lisa be seeing it? And then I can just ask, I'm like, dude, from where I'm sitting, this is how I'm perceiving the situation. But why don't you tell me what it's like from your armchair perspective? Because I don't know sometimes unless I hear it from you. And what I've found has been really interesting is that sometimes you've shared thoughts just in passing conversation. And I've gone, probably a year back in time and gone, oh, that totally makes sense as to, why she was thinking a certain way for this work stream that we were working on together. And so I guess that's communication really at the forefront of things. So for me, assuming good intent and keeping up communication, remembering that you can always ask if you're not sure instead of assuming.
Yeah, I absolutely think that I agree. And the same thing with you. You'll say something to me and that makes complete sense. And it will actually sometimes change how I analyze things and I learn from it. And I think, it's never occurred to me when we work together that there's ever not been positive intent. And I think that I try to replicate that in other work relationships sometimes too. So,
that's lovely.
I think it's really great. Now, moving along to this change in year, what is one lesson, idea or lesson, that you will take from 2020 into 2021? And what is one thing that you will plan to leave behind?
I think for me, it's the idea of a more flexible work day. There have been certain situations when you're home and I think on a normal work from home day pre-COVID, you always had a feeling like you had to be constantly available during sort of the 9 to 5 type hours. And I think now there's been a lot more understanding that in these pressure circumstances, people may have other things to tend to, or, there are limited hours to get errands done otherwise. And so as long as everyone's getting their work done, hopefully the non-micromanagers out there are showing good leadership in terms of trusting their teams. So for me, I think pulling away from that idea that everything needs to be exactly 9 to 5 in terms of being available at a moment's notice kind of thing. And I think one of the things that I've tried to leave behind, and I tried doing this at the end of last year, was working more on not saying yes to everything and just kind of burning out. But of course, 2 nanoseconds after I decided I was going to do that, there was the great flood of 2020 in my apartment, which meant that my life was turned upside down and sort of more stressful and burned out than usual. So that's one of the things that I personally will be working on. And it might sound counterintuitive because it's like, just do nothing for a bit or slow down. But actually slowing down can take some reprogramming. And part of what my struggle has been is that I'm kind of preachy about things like, service to others and the community. And I'd hate for there to be a situation where I say I'm unable to help in a certain circumstance. And then that person is like, well, you're a giant hypocrite, Mary, because you're always talking about how we need to send the elevator back down and pay it forward. And yet I've asked you for help and, you're saying that you don't have any capacity right now. So that part for me is a bit of a struggle, and it's prohibited me from doing what I committed to, which was trying to pull back a bit on doing so much. So that's something that I'm working on right now. What about you, Lisa?
Well, I think that one thing that I am going to take from 20 to 21 is similar to you, is this idea of, as long as you're getting your work done and others, to make sure that that I do that. I think that for me, I also am planning to re-engage in some things that I have not been as engaged in the last quarter of 2021, between certain work obligations, and I had moved, and some other things that were happening. There were a lot of things I wanted to do, and I did what you said was saying no. So my thing is, okay, now I'm energized and I can do this well. And again, I think the same thing you were just saying about being, feeling a little bit like, I always feel like I'm not doing enough. And in a way, I sort of accepted that at the end of last year, because I was like, I'm not doing enough, but it's been such a year, the COVID and living in Washington, there've been constant, different, protests or just demonstrations or other things. It's just, so now I'm also trying to leave behind the idea of, beating myself up for that. But what I am going to take into 2021 is really prioritizing and thinking, okay, these are the things over the last few months that are really important to me. And I really want to focus on some different extracurriculars that are related to ethics and compliance that I feel like I didn't do enough last year. But I guess I should re-say that, in that this year has opportunities. And I think it's important to focus on different things at different times. And that is the other part of taking it into 2021. So I think that those are the things that I'm, really trying to do. But I think that 2020 was a really, really tough year for us all. So that's where it comes down to. So I think that we're all still, a lot of us are figuring out how to regroup right now.
I think on that point, the next question is related. How do you see management and leadership and compliance changing over the course of 2021?
Yeah, I think it's still going to be on a similar trajectory as it was in 2020, that because of what you said about the flexibility. But I also think that we've had new priorities. We have different things that have changed. So I see, and in the U.S., back to having a new administration, I think management and leadership just continues to adapt to this ethical decision-making model. Things that we've had guests talk about, the idea of, giving voice to values or things like that. I think we're continuing to evolve into that type of a profession as opposed to the sheriff profession. And I think that the situation that we're in right now with people who are fortunate enough to keep their jobs and work from home, it's a whole different way. There is a different way of working. So I think managing that and being a leader that can, inspire and help your teams as these circumstances change and continue to change when there is a return to work is a huge part of it. And I also think that from the substantive standpoint, continuing this evolution into we are the ethical decision makers and the do the right thing people will just keep going that way.
Yeah, I think that's right. If I'm permitted to toot my own horn for a moment, I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal last year saying that we're almost becoming the moral guardians of companies now. And so I think that's along a very similar vein to what you're thinking. We're seeing this shift very much from areas where we may traditionally have thrown certain subject matters to HR, but now compliance is doing more of acceptance of reputational risk, which often encompasses people and culture aspects, and compliance is now taking that as a portfolio as well. So I'm completely aligned with you on that one. I think another aspect that's going to be challenging for management is that during the crisis, and how I would consider it is that something that I saw, which defined this well, and just to paraphrase, is you are not working from home, you are at home working during a global health crisis. And during that time, I think we cut ourselves a lot of slack for aspects of not necessarily being able to keep up team bonding, team building, team morale. I think everyone was reacting and doing the absolute best that they could in those circumstances. However, looking more to the long term now, we've got to consider ourselves in an environment where we're probably not going to be in the office 5 days a week. I think, especially for compliance officers, where companies are going to allow us to work from home a greater proportion than before. I think compliance lends itself really well to being able to work from home for some of the work that we do. And so for managers, it's going to be about this shifting paradigm in terms of presence in the office and how that might be affecting team morale and team building. And related to that, I think we're going to start seeing more geography agnostic or remote positions. So where once you might have had the majority of a compliance department, or at least the base for the team at the company or regional headquarters, we might be more geographically dispersed, which of course has some benefits, but it also can present some challenges in terms of building a cohesive team.
That makes sense. It'll be interesting to see, I think, what direction that goes. Because I think for some companies, there's going to be a higher comfort level. And then for some organizations, there'll be we need everyone back in one place. It's been too long.
And I think what'll be really interesting about that is that then going to be a marker of what could become a desirable workplace, right? Because employees are going to want to be aligned with companies that are thinking along the same lines as them. So if you find yourself in a situation where you and the company you work for now have differing views as to what's appropriate for in-office presence, that could signal a shift in terms of turnover, not just in compliance, but I think across the board.
Yeah. And I'll say one other thing about that. The interesting part is I think we traditionally think people who may want to be working from home more frequently, there's going to be the other side of it. Organizations who think they need less office space. And some people, given their situation and circumstance at home, may say, I need offices. So it's going to be interesting in a lot of ways. So with that, I'm going to change it over a little bit. Since we're now at 2 years into the podcast. So what is the biggest challenge? I'm just so interested. This full disclosure was a Lisa question for Mary. 2 years in, what is the biggest challenge you have with doing the podcast?
So I think, and this isn't really a huge problem as I see it, but one of the things that I've found difficult to predict is what topics might be particularly of interest to our audience. And it can be surprising. Sometimes I think something is going to be, very well received, and maybe there's not as much engagement about that particular topic than others. So this certainly isn't a huge deal breaker type negative, but it's something that I have found difficult to anticipate and plan for. And so with that, what I would say is if you have specific feedback for us about anything that you particularly would be looking for in terms of what you'd like to see, please don't hesitate to reach out, because Lisa and I are still learning, and the patterns and the data, when we do have an opportunity to look at it, doesn't always come with the rationale as to why figures are a certain way. So if you're able to help us out with that and then better target our episodes and our topics, that would be much appreciated. What about you, Lisa?
Well, I think that, for me, keeping it fresh and interesting, making sure that that what we have is a good, continuing our commitment to diversity in many, many different ways, which is not that hard given our community as a whole, but making sure that we're really giving, I really want to have, help targeting, and I want to learn from our audience, what everyone wants to listen to. And then also at the same time, balance things we or others in the community think need to be heard. And for me, it's to keep it something that is interesting within the things that I think make this podcast unique, is that we get to learn about women's experiences, many different people, and things that people are passionate about. And those are two things that I really, really love about it. But again, making sure we still keep that fresh and interesting, and that, we're providing that value, I always find to be, a little bit of a challenge to do it right. The other one that's always the hardest for me is how far in advance do you record? Because I want to give it enough time, but also some of the things are so topical that if you do it too far in advance, you might miss things. Those are kind of my bigger ones.
This next question I really love, and it's, what are your favorite traits that you admire in each other?
Well, first of all, I, on a completely 100% professional level, this is not how much, how awesome you are as a person, but your organization is something to be admired and inspired by, because wow, Mary's, I'll think I'm ahead of the game on certain things. And then she's like, well, this is what's happening in March. Okay. So in a completely professional, your organization, I think on the other one is sort of your passion and commitment to, doing the right thing, and, sending the elevator back down. And, you're always willing to stretch and challenge. So, and use your excitement and passion about this to do that. And that's probably, two of my favorite things, and also your excellent taste in restaurants and fun places to hang out. But, the first two are the ones that I think are what are most impactful to me as a partner in compliance.
Thank you for that. The first one that comes to mind for me is that sometimes you are just so funny, and we can be talking about a really serious topic, and you just come out with a little line that cracks me up. And I think that's a trait to be admired in all compliance officers. I think it really helps with the relatability and humanness of that crafting. So I so appreciate that you're fun to work with. And another aspect is that you're really thoughtful about things. So unlike me, you tend not to dive in without thinking about the bigger picture first. And so what that means is that sometimes when there's something that I've got in mind, oftentimes it's really hard to derail me from once I've got an idea and I think, oh, this is fantastic. This is my way forward. And you are someone who, when you have a really intelligent idea, it completely stops me in my tracks. And a lot of the time I'm forced to go, dang, that's actually way better than what I was thinking. And so not everyone derails me in such a positive way. And I think you have some really fantastic ideas or ways of looking at things that I never would have seen without you. And it leads us obviously to a better product. And I guess that's the whole point of why diversity is scientifically proven to make for stronger teams. But I really like your intelligence and thoughtfulness when it creates, well, I mean always, but in terms of the positive effect that it has, means that we create a higher quality product. And so those would be two of my faves about you.
Well, thanks. I will take both of them, but I will say that becomes a lot easier because you usually come up with a very thoughtful, detailed idea and you've gone so far ahead. And did you think about this or that? It's almost like editing. It's a lot easier sometimes to edit, but I appreciate that a ton. And then we have, are there any personal or professional New Year's resolutions that you want to share?
So I typically am not a big New Year's resolution type person. I like to hustle and create goals all throughout the year. And I know that New Year's and obviously performance review evaluations can be an excellent time that are dedicated. But I like to create goals all throughout the year and strive for them and keep thinking about what's going to be new and different that I can work on. So nothing specific apart from the redo of the trying not to get burned out and being better about committing where I can, but also being brave about saying no where I can't.
And I think that's great. I think I was talking about some similar things earlier about things leaving behind. I think that's pretty similar. So I don't know if I have as much to add to that one, but it is the same type of thing that, how do I, be most efficient and, where do I build? But I think that I also don't have the specific one. I would, like to get a little more regimented with some parts of my schedule that kind of fell apart in December, but that's pretty much like most of the world. So,
yeah.
So that one, yeah, I think we covered that a little bit earlier too, when we were talking about what we're leaving behind and what we're trying to do.
True.
So
it's a learning curve you anticipate being on in 2021, and how do you plan to navigate it?
I think there are two that come to mind for me. One is one of the things that I think we all are challenged with, but I'm at a point where sometimes when I'm caught in the weeds when I need to think more strategically. So I'm really working hard to work on my strategic thinking as opposed to the person who reaches out the most with the problems. So I have to, so that is one of the learning curves that's constant for me, is to be thinking more about the program as a whole as opposed to being, the helper all the time, which I want to be, but that doesn't always need to be me. But I kind of have, that's one of my, one of the two. And the other one is I want to improve, and I guess this will keep me honest on it. In terms of like LinkedIn or other things, I could be a better contributor. And I sometimes find it to be a lot when I see all the things out there that I want to read and do and things like that. So I am going to focus a little bit more on trying to be more responsive, while at the same time, like for you, it's not our full-time job. So things like that, I really want to have a thoughtful social media presence. I mean, I think I do, but I really want to improve that in a way that's valuable to me and to, the community out there. So I haven't quite figured that one out right away. So, but those are kind of the couple things for me. But what about you?
I think this is as you know, a place where I come from a place of weakness when it's a situation where I am not going to be well prepared for it. And for me, that would be because of the pandemic situation being unprecedented. It's a lot harder to anticipate the types of issues that we might come up against in 2021. So I think what I'm going to have to work quite a lot on is not feeling flustered when new issues arise, and then also reaching out to the community and learning from others. So, for example, Matt Kelly, who is a friend of GWIC, he published an article today, which is on our day of recording, which is 5 concerns for compliance officers to think about. And COVID's in there, the recent security breach by Team Russia is in there as well. So remembering that I'm not in it alone, I'm not the only one trying to sort out how to muddle through coming out of the crisis, I think is going to be the best way. So working together as part of our wider team on the issues that may arise.
Mary, you've got me on the breaking news for today. But everybody, if you haven't read Radical Compliance yet, please go ahead for, on this and everything else, plug for one of the great men in compliance that we have out there. And I guess with that, we have one last question that actually originally came during our book launch. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, but it's when it comes to, and here it goes, kind of paraphrasing, but when it comes to pioneering and overcoming obstacles, sometimes members of marginalized communities find themselves hyper aware of personal perception of both themselves and the community they represent. And sometimes it feels like, it's hard enough when you fail. That's how I understand it. But then you also are concerned about how that impacts other members of your community or, colleagues. So, the question to us was, how do we navigate through failures or things to improve while keeping our own perspective, not beating ourselves up too much, and helping, hold the door open for others?
So I guess I wear two major minority hats. One is being someone who's ethnically Hong Kong Chinese as part of my makeup, and coming from New Zealand is the other. And so I fully related to this particular question, and it resonated with me because it's exactly true. Whenever someone speaks kindly about, so a typical response that I get when I say I'm from New Zealand is people say, oh, every New Zealander I've always met is so friendly. And it makes me beam with pride, even though I don't have anything to do with that because I'm meeting this person for the first time. So that doesn't really reflect on me, and yet I feel it does because I relate to that group. And the other is when Hong Kong does really well. And of course, on the flip side is you always get sad when someone flies the flag for your group and they do something undesirable and you go, darn it, that sets us back, 5 years in a certain area or whatever it is. And so for me, I'm very aware of
Thanks
the fact
for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance.
A foreign worker
we hope
in a
you'll
different
join
country,
us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast
someone's
and
only
leaving a
exposure
review.
to a New Zealander or to someone with Hong Kong Chinese heritage. And so keeping that in mind, I always want to represent those groups well. But of course, I am not perfect. And so in times where I am not satisfied with my behavior or my quality of work product in any way. I try to keep being humble, self-aware, and talk about those things, because we simply cannot be perfect all the time. And I truly think that when you share with someone your deficiencies, or you admit to certain mistakes, that vulnerability, in many times it can make up for the mistake that you've made, or the negative action that has occurred. And so for me, it's about being open to the fact that I may not get it right every time, or that I may not say the right thing every time, and hoping that people will accept my commitment to do better. What about you, Lisa?
I think for me, it is a little different being, a white woman in the U.S. So the minority feeling is a little bit different. I mean, I am Jewish, but I think I try to focus on myself as an individual, and I work very hard, I think, on my own attempt to avoid implicit bias or other biases. But I also think that treating every person as sort of their own individual, and trying to avoid that, any stereotypes or concerns, because all hard workers feel bad enough when you do something wrong. I can tell you the things I wasn't crazy about from the last quarter of 2020 and maybe earlier. But you don't want to, that reflects on the professionalism of the individual. And I think that it's really important for all of us to always keep that in mind, and to basically train the others around us to work that way. So I would advise, try not to reflect on, your otherness. And as Steph Davis said years ago, everybody feels like they're the only something in a room very often. But I think as leaders and managers, our goal is to sort of celebrate that and not look at it as the minuses, but to try to look at the positives of it. The fact that everybody's going to make a mistake, no matter who they are. And if you're listening to this and think I don't make mistakes, guess what? That's still a mistake. So, just to think about that, and to really constantly look at and challenge all your different perceptions, and challenge perceptions of yourself as well, because I think all of us, everybody feels something about them is different, but that doesn't take away from the significance of marginalized communities and the level of pressure and the issues that come with that. I think it's just important for us as leaders to do what we can to, learn our own strengths and weaknesses, and keep emphasizing. And on the flip side, also to help others, and, for diversity and inclusion, and to remove barriers wherever we can. And these sorts of concerns are one of them. So that's my take on it.
Super.
It's a great question. I could talk about it for hours. So
that concludes our Ask Us Anything Take 2 episode. And thank you very much for the submissions that you put in, and all of the support that we receive from our audience. Thank you. It's a new year, and with that, Lisa and I are excited to debut our new cover art for this episode. So we have a fresh new look. And we're excited to hear what you think. And we have, as Lisa mentioned, some really exciting plans for the year ahead. However, I would say you influence those plans. So if there's anything that you'd like to see, hi, Rocky, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And we look forward to many more fantastic episodes with you in 2021. Happy New Year.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.